¿Aló? Sí. Bien, bienvenidas y bienvenidos. Bien, muy bienvenidas y bienvenidos nuevamente. Ahora queremos presentar en este segundo momento del seminario a la profesora Jing Hao, profesora asistente en la Facultad de Letras. La profesora Hao ha trabajado como investigadora postdoctoral en la Universidad Católica de Chile y en la Universidad Politécnica de Hong Kong, tras completar sus estudios de doctorado en lingüística en la Universidad de Sydney. Su investigación explora la construcción de conocimiento a través del lenguaje. Ha trabajado en particular con el inglés y con el chino mandarín, y también en particular ha abordado el lenguaje de la biología. Y además ha estudiado la aplicación de estas conceptualizaciones lingüísticas en la educación y la alfabetización académica. La presentación de la profesora Hao va a ser en inglés, pero uno de nuestros colaboradores les va a poder recibir sus preguntas más tarde en español, por si es que quieren hacérselas en cualquiera de los dos idiomas en el fondo. Y también les recordamos a todos los inscritos que en sus correos está la presentación de la profesora Hao traducida al español, por si les ayuda a seguir la presentación con esto a mano. Bienvenida, Jing. Aló, aló.
Okay, thank you everyone, and it's my pleasure to be here and present my work. I have something to say about the scientific language, and thank you Natalia and Margarita for your invitation. Okay, so the discussion this morning, during the panel discussion, it was very interesting, and I think that some of the questions that came up during the discussion hopefully can be also discussed, will be covered in my presentation, and we can continue the discussion after my presentation. Okay, so my topic today is a linguistic approach to the language of science. And I'm going to touch upon three different areas, right? Three topics. Firstly, I would like to address what is communication in teaching and learning science from a linguistic or social semiotic perspective. And the second thing I want to talk about is the relationship between knowledge, language, and text. And lastly, I would like to use a small part of my own doctoral research to show the development of language and knowledge in students' development, particularly in the biological science at the undergraduate level. Okay, so communication in teaching and learning science. Here I have a series of images I would like to show you, and you probably are very familiar with them already. Yeah. So here we have a diagram, two-dimensional diagram, and we can also have three-dimensional diagram. So these are the diagrams that I chose from the pedagogic texts, the textbooks that our lecturers use in this university. And in biology, for example, here we also have a relatively realistic illustration of the phenomenon that we study. And mathematical symbols, of course. And sometimes we also have gurus, people who are important in the field. And of course, long passages of texts. Right? Now, all of this knowledge that students acquire or they are being exposed to in learning, all of this knowledge can be recontextualized into this what is typical seen in the lecture slides, right? So as lecturers, we make PowerPoint slides, we present them in the lecture, and of course, also us. We present this work and we communicate with our students by our body language and our voice, right? Okay, so all of this teaching, somehow they are acquired by the students, and they are going to present their knowledge in this this is an example of a chemistry lab report, right? And students have to write a report to demonstrate their knowledge, like this. Sometimes like this. This is a biological research report, will be much longer and much more extended text. And of course, not just verbal language, and students also use diagrams like this one, a flow chart, to represent the analysis and the procedure in the laboratory experiment. Tables and charts, right? And mathematical symbols as well. I love this one. Okay. And sometimes, interestingly, in lab work, students also need to present or capture realistic images in the lab work, like this one. Or realistic images captured under the microscope. Okay. So here, we have a survey of different kinds of representation of meaning. All of these that I'm shown are the meaning-making resources. They make meanings. So communication in teaching and learning science, how we communicate with students about our knowledge and how students demonstrate their learning, is through using these resources. And these resources involves necessarily language, image, diagrams, mathematical symbolism, body language as well. That's why we need to have face-to-face lectures. And all of these above are meaning-making resources known as social semiotics. Okay, so all of these are social semiotics. Okay, so the question about how knowledge is transmitted or communicated in teaching and learning is the same question as what meanings are made. It's the same as what social semiotic resources are employed to make the meanings, right? What resources we use in biological science? What resources we use in chemistry? What resources we use in mathematics? Okay, so from this tradition of linguistics, which is called systemic functional linguistics, social semiotic resources, they are not random collections of meanings, but they actually systematized. There's a pattern when it comes to how meaning is made. And each semiotic systems, for example, language is one semiotic system, mathematical symbolism is another semiotic system, and we also have images, well, it's a different kind of semiotic systems. So each semiotic system has its own organizing principles, right? So how we organize meanings in images is not the same as how we organize images in the clause or in the text with verbal language. Okay, so these organizing principles defines the structure of the semiotic resources. And what social semiotician or a linguist like us, what we do is basically describe the structure of the meaning making and systematize the meaning making. Okay? Okay, so this tradition of linguistics or social semiotics come from this very famous linguist whose name is Michael Halliday, right? So Michael Halliday has this very famous saying, right? Meaning is choice. So it's very important because it means that you and I, every one of us, we constantly making choices of the meanings that we make on every communicative situation. So when it comes to teaching and learning, it's about the choices of meaning that we make, right? So we basically teach students what choices should you make, what kind of meaning that you can have. All right. Okay, so having a linguistic or social semiotic description, therefore, is very important because it helps us make explicit. I think this word came up in the panel discussion, right? Making explicit and making visible the communication of knowledge. The communication will be how to communicate through meaning-making resources in scientific disciplines, right? And this is another way to say, okay, literacy, right? What's the literacy? the scientific literacy, the literacy in biology. It's not the same as literacy in mathematics. It's not the same as literacy in chemistry. Right? Okay. All right, so the question I'm going to ask next is that where do we start to observe semiotic resources? So for linguists like us, where do we start, right? How do we explore this phenomenon of social semiotics? The answer is text. Okay. And what is a text? The text can be a product, a page that you probably have, right? And a text is also a process. So a text is this product that instantiates the choices of semiotic systems. So I am currently producing a text with my talk in this room, right? And this is a multimodal, multi-semiotic text in this room, right? So we're constantly also producing text with the semiotic resources that we have, right? So that's where we start. Okay, so here we have an example of a text, which is a laboratory report in chemistry, right, from our student. As you can see, if you look at this text, there are different kinds of resources being employed, right? Not just verbal language, but also multiple other kinds, right? That's realistic images, tables, charts, diagrams, etc. Now, students know, right? This seems to be a very good text. I don't know the knowledge itself, but it seems that this student is getting a lot of ticks, right? And we know the students knows that where the text starts, where the text ends, and how do we unfold this text successfully to communicate his or her knowledge. And here is the data that I analyzed in my research. It's a research report in biology. In this report, you can see that the students not relying so much on diagrams, right, a couple of tables, but most importantly, students need to know how to write a text, a long, extended text, right? Okay, again, the student knows where's the starting point, where's the end point. How do we unfold this meaning in the text? All right, so this tells you that there is a conventionalized pattern behind the text, and students intuitively or perhaps explicitly, the lecturer told them how to structure your text, right? So this knowledge about this convention of a text is known as genre. So what is a genre? A genre is a recurrent configuration of meaning. So it's recurrent because, well, this research report shares something, right? Have something in common with that research report. This lab report have something in common with that lab report. So there is a recurrent pattern of meaning making. And this configuration of meaning, because it's not just one meaning, there's multiple meaning, a collection of meaning that is made, right? Recurrent. And it's staged. Why it's staged? Because there is a sequence of how text is made, right? We necessarily have introduction before conclusion, right? You can't give your conclusion at the beginning, or you provide results first before you show the procedure. And it's goal-oriented because every text has its own communicative purpose. And my text right now, right here, also has a communicative purpose. Right? All right, so that is genre. Now, what are the typical communicative purposes in scientific disciplines? In science, we typically to describe and taxonomize. We need to describe the phenomenon, and scientists, like linguists, we love categorizing things, right? We taxonomize things. To explain, we want to know the cause-effect relationship behind the phenomenon. We actually want to generalize the causality, right? To retell events, what did I do yesterday in my lab? What were the processes that I followed? And to argue, right? That's how we produce an argument in science, right? To convince other people that my arguments mattered. And these purposes are captured by genre theorists or scientific literacy, people working in literacy, in educational linguistics, as report, explanation, procedure recount, exposition. That's just our way of categorizing semiotic resources. Okay, so there has been a long tradition of recognizing in teaching and learning across subject areas what kind of communicative purposes, what kind of genres students need to produce. Right? This work came originally from school level, but at the same time, all of these genres that have been identified also being extended to the tertiary level. Right? So in my own research, all of these genres covered here. So what do we have? We have engaging genre, telling stories, right? Sharing anecdotes. And then we have informing genres. So explanation, reports, procedural recount, and then evaluating genre, we have arguments. So all of these ones can occur in tertiary level scientific disciplines. And in my research of biological recount, or biological science, and all of these genres also occur, right? Okay, so in my study of lab report and research report in biology, you can see that students do follow a convention of lab report, research report, right? We have the stages. Students know that there are different sections: introduction, method, results, discussion, conclusion, right? Likewise in the research report. That's the typical headings that students follow, right, in structuring their report. But within introduction, the elemental genre, that's the kind of purposes, right? In your introduction, what do you need to do? To introduce? Or you might have to explain, right, a little bit. Depends on the nature of your report. You might have to write a short explanation, explain this phenomenon. Or you might have to describe this phenomenon, right, to set up the context of what this phenomenon is about. And in the method, you have to give a procedure recount in terms of, okay, so this method I'm going to adopt. What did I do, right? So a recount of what happened in the past. And we also have results, and then in discussion, you have to explain the phenomenon that you have studied in the lab, right? And also argue, exposition, argue that, okay, so this is a valid finding, why, right? Okay, so based on these stages, it's possible to also identify very specific communicative purposes, right? Now, so students, they have lecture notes, lab work, pedagogic texts like textbooks, etc. They grab all of this knowledge by producing a text like this, right? A report. And this process, you basically re-instantiate the knowledge, right, to recontextualize that knowledge into a different text, a different communicative purpose. All right, my next question is, what do we talk about when we talk about language? What kind of principles that we follow when we study language? Okay, so from here onward, I'm going to focus a bit more on language, right? Because that's the focus of my own research, right, in the past several years. All right, so language is a kind of social semiotic resource, right? And when talking about social semiotic resource, of course, we also have our underlying organizing principles, right? So one important principle of language is to look at what are the functions, what are the communicative functions of language. So we use language to, firstly, express and connecting ideas in the subject area, right? That's the factual knowledge, the knowledge that you have in your subject area, right? So we call it ideational meanings. We also enact a relationship with readers and listeners, right? So how we communicate linguistics with our colleagues is not the same as how we communicate linguistics with our students in the classroom, right? So you have to have a sense of audience, the readership, etc., right? So we use language to also enact that kind of relationship. And third one is we compose information, right, in a cohesive and coherent text. So no matter it's a written text or verbal text, right? Well, when we produce the text, we're conscious of where the information goes, how the information flows, right? So that's the textual meaning of organizing your ideas and your interpersonal meaning in the text. Okay, so all of this meaning matters when it comes to students writing the text, right, demonstrating their knowledge. Okay, so in my study, I analyzed the development of students' knowledge through language, through the linguistic analysis, right? And I analyzed particularly undergraduate students' biology text. Well, there are lots of lab reports and lots of research reports, right? So these are the typical texts that I analyzed. And in my study, particularly, I traced one student who was high achiever, right? Had distinctions, high distinctions, which is above 75, above 85% in all of her assessment, right? So I analyzed how she developed her knowledge through examining her language, right? Okay, so when analyze knowledge construction, typically we can come from top-down perspective, right? Thinking about what kind of knowledge in the science, right? And one is static perspective, how taxonomies are established, developed, right? And the second thing is how activities, well, activity could be doing science, also activity could be explaining the phenomenon of science, right? So that's more a dynamic perspective. Okay, today I'm only going to focus on activities, right, from a dynamic perspective. All right, so another thing I want to establish here is that when students come to demonstrating their knowledge, writing about their knowledge, talking about their knowledge, they necessarily need to engage these two realms of meanings. And we call them fields, but here I'm just going to say it's two realms of meanings. One is the object of study, right? What am I studying? I'm studying dissecting a sea urchin, for example, right? I'm studying the protein activities, right? Or we also have study, right? So how do I do this study, right? How do I conduct this research, right? How do I conduct the experiment? So that's the realm of study. So doing science. So science itself and doing science. So, and within each of these realms of meanings, we also have specific meanings that I identified in my own analysis, right, in my own investigation. So we have exploration, which is a technical field. I'm going to show you one by one, give you examples which what they look like, right? So exploration, depiction, practice, and in study we also have a practice, reflection, inquiry. I'm going to show you what they are. Okay, so of course I'm presenting this backwards, right? These are the kinds of meanings I identified, but how do I identify those? Firstly, when we have a text, so here we have an example of an exploration field. We call it exploration, just a way of categorizing meanings, right? You can also say it's a knowledge field or it's a technical field, right? Now, I have an example here. The activity of protein can be controlled through influencing levels of gene expression or their activation or deactivation when already present in cytosol. Okay, now, with this passage, how do I analyze it? Firstly, as a linguist, well, we have to see how ideas are expressed. What ideas are expressed? I'm breaking down the ideas one by one, right? First idea, second idea, third idea, next one, right? That's expressing ideas. Secondly, I want to see how ideas are connected. Now, as we can see, we have through. What does a through mean? It's just a preposition in English, right? In Spanish, a través, I don't know. So these prepositions are important when it comes to text because they express a connection between meanings, right? And so here, by identifying the connection of meanings, I use a system of connections. What are the systems of meanings we have when connecting ideas, right? So now we can identify, okay, it's manner. Manner means by means of doing something, through using something, right? Or alternative, right? Or you can also have simultaneous, when, as soon as, once, right? So all of these connections, logical connections between ideas are very important when it comes to students writing, right? They might not be conscious about how they make connections. And I think that we had a discussion this morning about purpose and cause, right? Okay. Now, that's exploration. I want to emphasize it's exploration, and you probably notice, well, this is a linguist probably will notice that the tenses in this particular passage is all simple present, yeah? This factual information stay true yesterday and tomorrow and day after tomorrow, right? So it's factual information, it's timeless, it's tenseless, right? Now, next one, depiction. Depiction is something that students observe, right? And they just describe they depict what they observed, right? So in this case, I have bee galactositis. Bee galactositis, a kind of protein apparently, was only activated once the alternative food source was depleted. Now, so we have a past tense. This was activated in my experiment only when this happened, right? So again, we break down step by step what are the ideas there and how the ideas are connected. And depiction, because it's different from exploration, because it's very specific in that experiment, and I'm just describing that experiment. Now, next one, practice. So practice is very important. So students have to do some lab work, I believe, right? That's in most science disciplines, right? So practice, basically we have to follow the steps of doing the experiment, right? So in this case, set amount of dye were pipetted into 1 milliliter cuvette, and water was added to give a total volume of 1 millimeter. Yeah. Each solution was mixed and absorbances were read using a spectrophotometer. Okay, so that's an experiment a student did very early on in their first year. And again, break down step by step. What we have is the students doing it, right? So you can see that in terms of expressing the idea, these ideas are basically given one by one, right? And connecting ideas, some of the connections are explicit. For example, and, to give, to means in order to, right? That's a purpose, right? Not cause. And okay, so each solution were mixed and were read, etc. Using by means of using, right? So we can make explicitly how these ideas are actually connected within a very short amount of passage, right? Okay. And in terms of textual, one thing I would like to point out is that it's very, very important. Students don't say, we did this, and then we did that, and then we did that, right? It's important they say, this was done, and this was done, and that was done, right? So textually, we organize the information at the clause level as well, right? Okay, next one, reflection. So reflection is that after doing the experiment, students reflect on why that happened. So the results obtained were due to the treatments used. Now, the reflection is important when they have to use some sort of a causality, right? This was done, this was found, or this happened because, right? Because the treatment, different kind of treatment we used. So we have a consequence. Yeah. Now, next one. This one is interesting. And this is what I call an inquiry. In the inquiry activity, students have to deduce, making deductions among different phenomena that they've been exposed to. So here, basically the sequence is that we see this, the data shows to us this, we see that, and we know something, right? We make connection between what we know and what we see. And then we make a further deduction in terms of what we suppose or what we conclude, all right? So this connection of making reasoning, the activity of reasoning, is very important in students' learning. Okay, so, and interpersonally, in terms of establishing a readership with your audience, with your lecturer, with the reader, and it's also important that this is a place that when they make their own deduction, they actually acquire interpersonal meaning to demonstrate their deduction, their reasoning. So here, we can use words like we know, we can conclude, it is certain that. These sort of words to contract, we call them contraction because it contracts the alternative opinions. I'm very certain about what I'm saying, right? And no alternative opinion I will be let in this conversation. On the other hand, we could also have expansion. So we can say, we suppose, we suggest, it is likely that, yeah, these findings suggests. So when we say using this sort of words, we're basically saying that I'm not 100% sure, right? And then we call it expansion of alternative voices. So I allow other voices to disagree with me, right? Okay, so this really is not about students' confidence, right? It's not about that. And it's about a kind of academic language that they need to acquire, and knowing that when to be certain and when to have the hedging, right? Okay. So here we have an example of inquiry. Usually it's a longer passage of text because inquiry necessarily involves bringing different realms of meaning together. All right, the method in this particular case, radioactivity method, suggests that the accuracy of pipette was quite high throughout its range, with approximately 3% difference between set and measured volume for volume of 150 microliters and 200 microliters. However, the presence of significant variability between the readings obtained showed a high degree of imprecision. So there are some words that I highlight here. Those are the meanings which is more packaged up, and I need to unpack them, right? So was the high accuracy, highly accurate, and again, breaking down the meaning one by one, and also reveal how they are connected. As you can see that students, the ones that I shaded here, students basically say that. The method suggested, however, in the experiment, we saw this, and based on these two meanings that we have seen, we know why we conclude, right? And you can see that students, this is my unpacking of the language, right? Although the text set showed, students don't really say we, right? We know, and this is a layer of analysis that when it comes to analyzing the text, we have to unpack, right? To make the meaning be a bit more concrete and explicit for us to know how the ideas are actually expressed and connected. Okay, so just going back to the summary of these different realms of meanings. Okay. So how do these different realms of meanings interact in the text? Yeah. So I've showed you how I identify these meanings, but when it comes to the text, the real text, these meanings are all actually interconnected, right? So how do they interact? I'm going to give you snapshots of how they interact across 4 different texts, right? First year laboratory report, second year lab report, third year research report, and fourth year, this final year research report, right? So this interaction allows you to see a certain development of their meaning-making resource and then their knowledge. Okay, first year lab report. Students, this particular experiment, it aims to practice how to do experiment in the lab, how to use the pipette and how to calibrate it, right? Now, we have this practice, right? And we have the inquiry, basically connecting what they did in the experiment, right? We saw the readings of the pipette were minimally variable, so we know, right? Now, this is my unpacked text, right, to review the sequence. Now, we have a contraction. The students say we know, or actually students say it shows, right? It's very certain. Why is that? Not because that student is confident, just because this is actually, what actually happened in the text, right? There's nothing to be uncertain about. All right, so here we're using this maneuver of meaning is basically reporting the observation in the lab report. And secondly, in the second year lab report, we have this shift of meaning. We also have inquiry. As you can see, that inquiry is everywhere, right? We need to have this inquiry, how your thought process, your thinking process to connect all of these ideas. Now we have inquiry, and the meaning shifts from depiction, which is literally what they saw in the experiment. Here we have the flask demonstrated a higher level of big elastocytus activity. We saw that, yeah, we know that's what happened. And we conclude gene expression controls G galactositis. All right, so here students, again, they say we know because this is what they learned in the lecture, yeah, and they know this before they do the experiment. This basically confirms, right, what they learned. The experiment is just practice how to do the experiment. Now we have a shift from depiction to exploration, making connection between what you do in the experiment with the knowledge that you learned in the lecture. So also in second year lab report, now we also have an inquiry connecting ideas in the depiction, very similar to the lab report in the first year, right? But here, students have a finding that they propose, yeah. So we propose, so it suggests that this was only activated when alternative food source was depleted. Okay, so that's a deduction that students made. It's not the factual information that they know of, but they deduce that information from the experiment. Okay, third year research report. Now we have a different kind of shifts. What students do is that they draw on the knowledge they have learned in the lecture, right, in the pedagogical materials, and try to make sense of the observation that they have made. Here we have example. So members of chytrid may be involved in symbiosis with acnodia. Host microbial relationships may include parasitism, commensalism, and symbiosis. That's what they learned from the book, right? And based on their knowledge, they saw in the experiment, they did not appear to be any defects in the urchins. They were studying sea urchins. So drawing on the knowledge they've learned, based on their observation, they made a deduction saying that it's likely that the microbes present in the sea urchin studied were either commensal or symbiotic organisms, right? This is a deduction that they made based on their study and their knowledge basis, right? So we have, it's likely. So making sense of observation. Okay, again, same research report. Again, you can see that this is the third time we see the inquiry making sense of the depiction in the lab work, right? So we observe some smaller circular cells which appear to be opposite the direction of a Brownian current, and they also observe it in the regular sea urchin as they move against the current. It's likely these cells were motile. I'm making a deduction. And so further, we suppose that flagella were present. So they are making the deduction based on the experiment. From the phenomenon, one phenomenon leads to another. Right? Okay. Now, fourth year lab research report, this is interesting because students in this particular study that I conducted, I think quite similar here to UC in University of Sydney. So students in their final year, they actually can do a little research project, right? And they have to write this kind of research report. And in this particular case, students draw on the knowledge they have learned. All of these studies, so they have to draw a body of literature, right? So literature says that the insects and the health and the diversity of fungal community interact with each other. And talking about the physical processes, the chemical processes, etc. And based on that knowledge, what students does is to make a hypothesis. So we suppose that smaller fungal spores were more likely to retain integrity and viability after ingestion and passage through the insect gut than larger spores, because smaller ones are able to easily avoid maceration. Okay, so that's the deduction. And in their experiment, they're going to test that out, right? So in this particular case, students making hypotheses based on the knowledge that they have learned. And after the experiment, what they saw in the lab, under the microscope, they see that, okay, small spores were not, but the smaller spores, but not large ones, survived in the study. Okay, that's what they saw in the experiment. They concluded that spore sizes are important in fracture initiation dynamic. Okay, so now students are very certain that my hypothesis was confirmed, right? So we're confirming the hypothesis. So the last one is that in addition to that, a high-achieving student in the successful research project, they actually suggest, right? As you can see, when they confirm their hypothesis, they use contraction, yeah? This shows. However, they also make additional suggestions. We suggest that mandibular manipulation of ingested material determines the levels of damage sustained by the ingested material, rather than the physical and chemical activities. Okay, so they made actually actual finding, right? So suggestion for the scientific community, right? proposing new findings. Okay, so based on this analysis I'm showing you, the point here is that this high-achieving student, her knowledge certainly developed, right? And she went on to study biological science and did her research, right? Started her research career. Now, knowledge and language in this case, it was very apparent that it goes hand in hand in students' development. The development here, I mean both the knowledge and language development. So apprenticing in science is basically to learn to think and talk like a scientist, right? And the thinking and talking, importantly, rely on the social semiotic resources, right? So this successful student knew what meaning should be made in every step of her way, right? She was able to produce the text every time successfully. Now, the question is, can we make all students achieve this, right? Here I have a pedagogical consideration. By making explicit this meaning-making resource, right, being more conscious, be aware of the meaning-making resource, that's the first step that we can make this meaning visible for our students, right? And they know what is required, what should I do, what should I say? So these are very first step, right, when we considering giving students support. Now, but this work cannot, of course, be done by a linguist. And I can analyze text, right? But the ideas in the text, how the ideas are connected and expressed, I need some help, right, from the scientist. So to explore the science of language of science, of course, we need scientists who holds knowledge of science. We also need linguists who holds knowledge of language and social semiotics, and we work together, right? Okay, so that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias. Agradecemos a la profesora Jao por su iluminadora presentación, ¿no? Y abrimos el espacio ahora para sus preguntas, comentarios, reflexiones, que me imagino que abundarán después de esta presentación.
Thank you very much, Jing. It was very interesting. And I have a question regarding the way in which the students whose texts you work with for your thesis, whether the teachers of the disciplines had some kind of accompaniment in this work, with linguists, or how is it that they solved those different problems that I guess the teachers this morning exposed?
Right, okay, so the context, I was given the opportunity to study this data. Actually, I was made connected by the Learning Center, which is a students' literacy support center at the university, right? And we have biologists, right, professors, many professors from science. They actually send their students, right, to the Learning Center. So there's a collaboration between literacy teacher in the Learning Center and professors in science. And the science professors, sorry, I'm gonna sneeze. The science professors, typically they have this understanding, right, which is quite similar to the professors, what we have discussed this morning, the issues that they exposed, right, is that the punctuation, the sentence structure. Okay, so how to structure the text, right? So, and they have an idea of introduction, results, methods, etc. Right? We have to follow this convention. However, these professors, what they did at the time is to send students to the learning center to learn how to write a report, and sometimes these sort of literacy support are not necessarily disciplinary targeted. Right? We have some workshops for science, but you know, this what is conventionalized lab report, right? But you know, for lab reporting in chemistry is not necessarily the same as lab reporting in biology. There are some similarities, but I think that we can fine-tune the support in different disciplines.
Les recuerdo que pueden preguntar en español. La profesora entiende español, no puede todavía producirlo, pero lo entiende.
Español está bien.
English then. Do you have any proposal in how to teach students in their different disciplines how to apply this meaning making resources, or is it the niche of a task?
Okay. So firstly, we need to find out how meanings are made in each of the discipline, right? Each discipline. So we need to, that's when the collaboration between scientists and linguists matter, right? So we need to find out what meanings is made in your discipline, right? What is needed in your discipline? What kind of meaning is required from the students? And then we can develop literacy support. And then tomorrow, we'll have 2 presentations precisely about that. You know, how we're going to develop literacy support in the discipline. But the collaboration at the beginning, especially for linguists, for my opinion, is to identify, right? To identify what meaning is needed, what meaning is important in the discipline.
Well, thank you. I would like to make a comment about this separation that you made, the subject of a study and how to study. And I realize it when in mathematics, usually it's a theorem and a proof or demonstration. And what the student do is reading the proof from the first line, from the first palabra, word, to the last. And this is not the way you study a proof. You have first, you have to have the image, the big image, the big picture, and read it not like a literature, not like a story. So it is, this is one comment. Another one is this collaboration between scientists and linguists. I realized working with Natalia, which is very necessary, well, we learned a lot from Natalia just by explaining what are our difficulties. Because she's not a mathematician, so the way that we express and we say the problems, the question that she asked, we just realized that, oh, this is the problem. This is what the students don't understand. So it's really amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So in response to your first comment, it's absolutely true. In fact, according to the discipline that you are concerned with, right, the separation between object of study and study is different. For example, you could have a discipline, I don't know, technology. The object of study itself is doing, you know, how we do things. And in biological science as well, sometimes students, the object of their study in the first year lab report is how to use a pipette, right? So the object of study is not protein, is not sea urchin, is not fungi, right? But these 2 fields always exist. There's always object of study. There's always how you do it, right? But based on the discipline, the division shifts, right? The meaning shifts. And in response to your second comment, absolutely right, because what we do typically, most of the time, as human beings, we do things without realizing what we do. So it's intuitive, right? Such as using language, using Spanish. Well, as a native language speaker of Spanish, before you study grammar or linguistics, you use Spanish without knowing how and why, right? It's intuitive. So in discipline language, it's the same, right? You have a discipline literacy, the language of science. As teachers, we use it intuitively, right? But this process, by collaborating with linguistics, the job that we do is to making the meaning explicit, raising the awareness or raise the consciousness of how we make meaning.
I have a question here from Andrea de la Universidad Alberto Hurtado. She asked me to translate for you, and she wants to know what do you think about what's the best stage in the training of a student that would be more relevant to introduce this kind of linguistics approach into their learning. She's asking because she's training to be a science teacher, so she's interested in this, in your opinion about that. So when should we start talking about this for these training teachers?
Training teachers of science in terms
Yes.
of the stages.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I think the important part, again, is what kind of communicative purposes that we need, right? So when I show the stages, like we tell students you need to write an introduction, you need to write a result, etc., right? And the question really is that, do you have to describe this phenomenon in the introduction? Do you have to explain this phenomenon in the introduction? And then that's the first step, right? But as a scientist, as a teacher, right, by collaborating with a linguist, you're more aware of when we describe what kind of language that we need when we describe, what kind of language we need when we explain. By having that awareness, that consciousness, right, allows you to have to begin to model for students. Okay, so here we are explaining this phenomenon. How do we do it, right? Here we are describing how do we do it. So when students, you ask students, okay, write a report, make sure to describe this phenomenon in the introduction. Well, then they know, okay, so it's not just goes on and on, talk about something, and they try to invent something, fill in the page, right? They know, okay, we need to describe it, and that requires certain language resources to do so. Yeah, so training teachers, now, start from now.
Hi, thank you very much. I have a question regarding your study. You said that you followed the progress of a high achiever, right? Very successful student, but my concern if you have access to follow students with less success, because the main issue for us is to understand what are the problems in the learning of those students that are in risk of, failing the course. So if you had that chance in the analysis, what are the issues that they face that are more problematic? For example, connect ideas or analyzing the source, etc. So
Yeah. Okay. So to begin with, knowing how to give students advice, right? We need to know what advice to give, right? To give advice, telling students that, okay, you're not doing this right, you have to know what is right, right? So my analysis in this particular work is basically making explicit what is needed, right? But of course, the next step with this knowledge is to compare this kind of successful writing literacy development with the not so successful ones. And we can actually know what you should be doing and what is the problem that we should be doing to improve that. Yeah. So I'm hoping this project will be a chance for us to apply this knowledge to supporting students. Yes, I haven't done it yet, but hopefully this is the knowledge that Natalia and Margarita can take away.
¿Alguna otra pregunta, algún comentario, algún reclamo?
Voy a hablarte en español, Jing, solo para desafiarte. En el café estuvimos hablando de los textos escolares y cómo presentan la información. Si a partir de los textos escolares hubiera un trabajo como el que tú mostraste, habría una reflexión mayor respecto a lo que se está enseñando y el estudiante podría entender también mejor aquello que se le enseña. Lo que subyace, sí, porque hay procesos que son difíciles de identificar en los libros escolares. Entonces, esto aplicaría muy bien para poder escribir textos escolares claros, con objetivos claros, con contenido claro. Ese es mi comentario solamente.
Comment, the multimodal literacy is really, really important as well, right? And this comes, for example, with my students. Sometimes I tell them, maybe it's better you put your findings in the table, right? To show your results a little bit more effectively. So sometimes for linguistic students, right, probably they are more thinking about words, right, and talk about it. And I would say actually, okay, what about use a chart? What about you use a table and to communicate your ideas a bit more effectively. Yeah, so this is also part of literacy that I'm just reflecting back, right? For linguists, that we need to also know how to expose students to multimodal literacy. Yeah.
Thanks, Jing. My question is actually not for you. It's for the scientists in the room, if that's okay. I'd like to ask scientists in the room if what you have heard from Jing, if you recognize those meaning-making processes and that development process that she has outlined there. I know it's perhaps hard from the first time that if you've seen it for the first time, but I just wondered if anybody thought, aha, yes, I noticed that, or I agree.
Thank you. I'm going to talk in English, but it's very rusty, my English, so sorry. I'm psychologist, so I'm from social science, no? It's kind of different structure in our kind of reporting. So yes, we identify some similar structures, but we try to differentiate between description, description, and interpretations all the time. So, and that's different about natural science. We write and talk every time about in expansion mode, not in construction mode. You know?
Suggestive.
Yeah, we're about the we always think in the dynamic process of cognition, of knowledge. It's just an state and not an established knowledge, you know?
And I want to comment following upon that. So we can certainly relate to that as linguists, because students need to write interpretation report, and they interpret what they analyze in the text, and typically it's also suggestive. So it's also the expansion way of talking.
¿Algún científico que quiera responder la pregunta? O científico, no científico social, quiero decir.
I don't really have a lot to say, but I just cannot resist the temptation to say something. Since we're in the middle of the World Cup, I want to make an analogy with a football game. There's a difference between a beautiful goal and another. Sometimes the ball just goes inside, but just by chance, or because it was too close to the goal. I think in science we're often too focused on the goal, whether the goal happened or not, and not that much in the process. So the paper will be a good paper if it has good results, if it produced something new, and nobody really cares whether the paper was beautiful or not. Now, I think that, which is what I try to say in the morning, I think that if you prepare yourself to do a beautiful game, you will have a better chance to make good goals and to make goals. And I think that's the main point. So this is, you can say, well, at the end of the day, what I care about is whether I did a goal or not. But I think that if you really want to make many goals, a good strategy is to prepare yourself to have a beautiful and a good aim, and probably the chances of scoring a goal will be higher. That's how I see it.
It's a lovely metaphor. I love it. Yes, absolutely. So we basically prepare students. Okay, so this is a game. How are we going to plan that, right? And I'm going to take you next to the net so that you can have a go, right? So yeah, we need to strategize that for students, for their development.
Voy a comentar esto en español porque creo que es interesante porque soy psicóloga, perdón, porque no pertenezco a las ciencias reales, pero hice mi tesis doctoral en la percepción de los estudiantes de pregrado sobre textos científicos, ¿no? Entonces es interesante porque ellos, ahora me doy cuenta que en su trabajo también identifican estas estructuras, ya sea como formales o informales, o sea, respecto a forma o contenido, y mis datos dicen más o menos lo mismo, ¿no? Que estudiantes en ciencias y en ciencias sociales tienen o sea, como identifican estructuras similares, ¿no? O sea, los énfasis son diferentes, pero las identifican como marcadores como de comprensión o como de qué tan científico es un texto, ¿no? Entonces es súper interesante ver cómo en tu trabajo lo replican de manera más o menos exitosa. Entonces creo que hay mucho que seguir investigando en esa área, como para ver cómo lo identifican y cómo lo usan luego en su propio trabajo.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. So the comment here I would like to follow up that is that yes, so whatever discipline that you're in, well, we're in academia, in institution, right? Students need to produce academic register, right? So the knowledge, that's why I made comments that we don't say I, right? And students actually say this pipette was calibrated and instead of I calibrated, right? So a lot of a range of linguistic resources that we actually need when we produce language which is in academic register. But importantly, sometimes, right, based on the disciplines, right, we also have a technical knowledge. Some of the technical knowledge is really the knowledge that is embedded in the words, right? That's beyond the register of academic register itself, right? Students actually need to know the language from those disciplines with the technical words, the technicality, how to organize information with the technicality. So there's separation between the ideational meaning of the subject matter and the textual meaning that is needed for academic register. Yeah, so I think the literacy support is very important for literacy support, because the literacy support, typically we're not disciplinary experts, right? So the kind of support that we provide can be focused more on interpersonal meaning and textual meanings, and rely on students' knowledge and the collaboration with the disciplinary teachers to organize their ideational meaning of the subject matter.
Here. So thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have a question. Well, I had a question, but you already answered. But I have a follow-up question. What I understand is that you're taking this tacit knowledge that we all have as scientists or students of science. We know the structure of all papers, and my question was, why take this tacit knowledge and put it into words? And I understood that your answer would be that since you took the work of high achievers, this would be to help low achievers, right? My question now is, how could this help people outside of academia to understand papers or scientific texts?
Okay. So that is a different question from that question, right? It's basically changing the scientific academic register to a more common sense register. That means you need to change your language, right? So you're probably not going to say, this is I can't invent that on top of my head, but you can't say the gene expression or protein activities, blah, 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 right? You might have to explain that a little bit more concretely with common sense knowledge that students have, with examples that to exemplify this principle that you want to explain. So the kind of language shifts is to flesh out the knowledge, right? Unpack the knowledge for people who don't have that knowledge. But the problem is that the students need to know how to use their language to talk about that knowledge in the subject matter. Yeah. Yes, of course. Yes. That's changing genre as well as your language. You're changing your language, you're changing your register, you change genre as well, yes. So you can, for example, you want to explain I don't know whether in Chile you have this story of the life cycle of a frog from little, I don't even know how to call it when it's little. So this, I remember that when I was a kid, we had a little story, the narratives of the transformation of this little character, right? So in that particular sense, although you're teaching kids, young kids, a scientific phenomenon, but you're not using explanation genre, right? You are transferring that into a story for children, and they are learning that knowledge through a different genre, a different language. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your talk. I was wondering about an analogy that came to mind, and I would like to know where you think it might be breaking down. Because when children learn how to speak, as you well said, they do it intuitively, and we all have learned our first language in an intuitive way, without grammar or without knowing verbs or other meanings in that sense. But when children have difficulty learning how to speak for different reasons, they need help, and there are people who specialize in helping them to speak better and pronounce better and have better language skills. But usually, I think in that case, these specialists didn't start analyzing how high achievers learn. That didn't help them. I don't think that helped them. They needed to see what the particular difficulties were of the people who didn't learn. So I wonder why this would be different with scientific language. Why studying how the high achievers, or so to speak, intuitive learners learned would help us help the ones that are not intuitive learners.
Okay, so if I understood that correctly, well, I myself don't work in the field of speech therapy, and I know this is an area that linguists actually do work on. Well, but these linguists who work in the field of speech therapy, for example, they do have a knowledge of how language works, right? With that knowledge, they identify what is the problem and how we support them, right? So this tacit knowledge, or the knowledge itself about how speech works, is the knowledge, if you call it how language is supposed to work, right? Likewise, instead of saying it's a high achiever's knowledge, really it's the knowledge of biology, right? It's a knowledge that the students learn from their professors. That's the knowledge that they communicated in teaching and learning, right? So it's a knowledge of biology that we want to give to students, right? The language and the knowledge of biology we want to give to students. So it's having that knowledge allow us to be more aware of how to transfer that knowledge to the students. I wouldn't make a distinction between the knowledge or the language of high achiever or the language of not so satisfactory achievement. Right?
Tenemos tiempo para una última pregunta o comentario. ¿No? ¿Sí? ¿Con convicción o...? Sí.
Well, this was for the question your professor made. I've noticed, well, in my field of study, which is experimental plasma research, I've noticed certain structures that repeat in papers to explain certain things. For example, the experimental setup mostly almost always requires what is known as how is it? A pulse power generator, and it's always explained in the same way in every text, independent of what the purpose of the machine is. It's always the same structure, the same paragraph structure, and it's always the same type of diagram to explain how the plasma generated is being studied. So it's always the same kind of diagram with the field of view or the different diagnosis. So I will say that I've noticed this kind of meaning-making resources being used in the papers, at least in my field. And well, what Professor Max said, it's also true that the goal is the most important for scientific papers, but these resources are being utilized, and I think we are able to recognize them. That was it.
Ya, le damos las gracias entonces a la profesora Joaquín. Bueno, les agradecemos nuevamente a todas y todos los participantes hoy. Estamos muy contentas también por la convocatoria, por sus preguntas, por sus comentarios. Para nosotras también es un espacio de mucho aprendizaje también de escuchar a los colegas que vienen de ciencias, así que les damos las gracias por eso. Y por supuesto los dejamos muy, muy cordialmente invitados para mañana, para que nos sigan enseñando a nosotras las lingüistas. Mañana tenemos una jornada que está más orientada a la enseñanza, a cómo aplicar esta comprensión del lenguaje para la formación de científicos y científicas en relación con el desarrollo de estas que llamamos habilidades transversales, pero que lo que estamos tratando de como poner sobre la mesa es que es más que una habilidad transversal, tiene que ver con enseñar y aprender el conocimiento propio de la disciplina. Así que los dejamos muy invitados para mañana, inviten a sus amigos, a todos los que les pueda interesar esta actividad, van a ser todos muy bienvenidos. Y de nuevo muchas gracias a todos los profesores que estuvieron en el panel, a Laín, Masa, Cecilia, y a Jim por su presentación ahora. Y bueno, nos vemos mañana entonces. Que estén muy bien.